And we are live.
Hello everyone, and welcome to another DML Commons Salon. It's May 21st, and we're here for the fourth unit of the design-based research strand of the DML Commons series, hosted by the DML Hub. This is the first salon in our unit on critiques of design research and responses from the field. This week we have Phil Bell and Megan Bang from the University of Washington joining the DML Commons once again, and this time to discuss the challenges and limitations of design-based research in three key areas. First, methodological limitations of DBR. Two, issues of agency in DBR projects. And three, challenges related to the design of scalable interventions. In this salon, Megan and Phil will reflect on how these critiques have been addressed in theory as well as on the ground, and consider possible new directions for DBR that are emerging from the field. My name is Nick Wilson. I'm a postdoctoral scholar at the Center for Teaching and Learning at Stanford University, and I'm co-facilitating the salon with Peter Wardrip from the University of Pittsburgh and the Children's Museum of Pittsburgh. Peter and I are super excited to have Phil and Megan join us for today's salon, but before we jump in, let's have everyone just do a quick introduction of themselves for our audience. So Peter, would you like to start?
Sure. So I'm Peter Wardrip. I'm a researcher at primarily the Children's Museum of Pittsburgh, and I do a lot of research related to our museum's makerspace called MakeShop and the educational outreach experiences that we facilitate through MakeShop.
Great. Thanks, Peter. Megan and Phil, do you guys want to go?
Sure. Hi, everyone. I'm Megan Bang, and I'm a professor in the Learning Sciences and Human Development at the University of Washington. And I do a lot of work with DBR, both in after-school spaces, community-based settings, and in schools, from preschool through middle school and high school.
That's great. And I'm Phil Bell, also a professor of Learning Sciences and Human Development here in the College of Education at the University of Washington. And I also executive director of the Institute for Science and Math Education, where we have a lot of equity-focused STEM education projects both in and out of school, where we do a lot of DBR work and a lot of design-based implementation research, which is working at broader scale. The other kind of thing I'll just put on the table right now is that Megan and I have the pleasure of co-teaching our DBR methods sequence here. So we have kind of a history of discussion and work with a broader set of folks here on campus around the work.
Great. Thanks, everyone. And finally, for those of you who are joining us via the web, you can use our Etherpad to follow along with our discussion and post questions to Megan and Phil. The link to that is etherpad.mozilla.org/DMLCommons Unit 4 DBR. You can also find that on the dmlcommons.net website. You can also follow along with our Twitter back channel using the hashtag DMLCommons. All right, and so I guess, well, first things first for all of our online participants, while we're getting settled in, feel free to enter in your name, institutional affiliation, and your own Twitter handle under the roll call section of the Etherpad. So if we're good to go, then I think we'll jump into our conversation on critiques of DBR. So Megan and Phil, can you tell us about what the methodology of DBR, or what about the methodology of DBR may be vulnerable to criticism and why, and maybe what can be done about that?
Sure. And I kind of, as we kind of find our way into conversation, really would just encourage the broader group of folks that were able to join us today to really work with us to make this an interactive dialogue that serves your interests as much as possible. So with design-based research coming into the learning sciences field, kind of formally in the early 90s, as it started getting coined as design experimentation, and then has evolved since. It's continued to become more and more of kind of a worked-out thing, although it's still, you know, a work in progress in terms of having it as a design approach. So that. There's been a lot of discussions around the methodological details of the work over time. I would say that they've kind of been shifting. There's a kind of one way in which that happened about 12 years ago. There was a lot of concerted discussion around it as a research method or methodology, and whether or not it should be thought of one kind of in that unique way. in many senses, like learning sciences as a field holds on to DBR as its kind of signature method. And so then it kind of provokes the conversation of, how is it similar or different to other methods of the social sciences? As I have kind of thought about that, been engaged in those conversations, written about it, there are different dimensions of that critique, and they come from different places. And just to kind of summarize a little bit of it, and then I'll let kind of Megan kind of add on to this. In one sense, like, it's just boundary work that people are doing kind of in the sociology of science sense, trying to figure out, like, what is scientific, what do we count as a scientific method to go after a set of questions and phenomena. And so you can kind of think about people worrying about, like, the knowledge claims that DBR produces and whether or not they kind of are warranted in the right ways, and whether or not people guard against threats to validity in the work, just all sorts of different dimensions. Part of what was kind of, I think, interesting to me about the conversations that I ended up writing about was that people were just assuming, number one, that there should be a method, kind of a singular way that DBR happens, when in fact I think DBR studies a broad variety of phenomena, some moment-to-moment interactions on up to long multi-year pathways of learners, and to think that there's one method is kind of a problematic notion, but that is often the subtext of conversations, that we should be moving towards the one way to do it the right way. The other part of that is that people are doing different kinds of theory work within DBR. So DBR for me is a little bit more of a general methodological approach, just like we have others in the social sciences, whether it's historical, experimental, interpretive, legal. Like, we have other modes of inquiry, and a design mode of inquiry is like a new one, kind of in that set. And then within that, you can focus on different theoretical issues and problems. And so I think some of the conversation gets a little bit more clear if you think about somebody doing a cultural psychological DBR project and, like, how to do that well, versus another group that's doing a more social cognitive project and how to do that well. And so part of what I've argued for is that we need to kind of get a little bit more dialed into the theoretical work going on in order to understand what methods and qualities of the work allow it to be kind of a usable way to produce knowledge.
Yeah, so I think the only thing that I'd like to kind of extend with what Phil's talking about is that I think at one point we could have a conversation about DBR getting critiqued from folks that don't identify as DBR researchers, and I think that there's some pretty, I think Phil's talked about that a little bit. I actually think that one of the things that's emerging that's really interesting is to think about how the field has grown enough that we have some within community critiques now that I think is a manifestation of what Phil is talking about around different theoretical orientations. And to the extent that the critique isn't about narrowing to a singular method, I actually think it's really generative for our field, because it's one way to work out sort of a theory-practice dialectic that can get us to actually broader expansions of what we understand about teaching and learning broadly. I do worry, though, that it's taking this turn that there's a singular right method that misses the opportunity of what a critique of DBR could offer the field.
Mm-hmm. Do you have any examples, sort of off the top of your head, what might be some critiques that are happening within DBR itself?
I think one that we could talk about, and it kind of brings us to kind of some of the more exciting, newer modes of DBR work, and whether or not people are kind of up to the challenge in some ways, or are on board with this particular focus, is to be a lot more explicit about the politics of the work, both kind of the context in which things happen, as well as understanding the particular politic that the study is engaging with, and trying to do progress on. And I think we have just kind of a history of conversation around quote-unquote scientific approaches to building knowledge that make kind of that formalizing work of the political dimension like a more problematic discussion. And I think part of what we talked about in the previous DML webinar was just that, getting very explicit about the problematic that's in play that you're engaged with, and that could be achievement gap kind of perspective or whatever, and how you're pushing back on that. But trying to get very explicit about like what the work is that the DBR project is doing in the political dimension is something that is always in play implicitly. And I think there's a growing number of people calling for that to be kind of explicitly brought forward. So that's one pocket, and I don't know if you want to think about that.
Well, I just want to say that I think that so at least in our work in the early 2000s, there was this sort of growing, so where's the equity focus in DBR work? And I think lots of folks assumed that had a kind of stance about equity that frankly might have been under-theorized, but it partly reflected their theoretical orientation to equity as well as a theory of implicit change that just hadn't quite surfaced, right? And so there was early questions about, so what does DBR have to say about issues of equity, about issues of power, about and perpetuating. So how might we be perpetuating some of those things? And what is really exciting to me about DBR as a way to keep thinking about that is because most of our inequities are by social design, right? And so there is this really interesting opportunity to do a lot of work around thinking about how design actually helps us imagine more equitable futures and try in ways that really have the possibility for us to have a different kind of conversation about the problems of inequities at social scale. And I think that that's an exciting and really underdeveloped area. I mean, obviously there is some work, but I can imagine that continuing to be a pretty fruitful place for us to engage with.
Peter, do you have anything you want to add to
that? Not at this point, no. Actually.
I think one thing that's worth kind of underscoring is that often when people outside of DBR traditions learn about it and react to it, these are researchers typically that I've interacted with. I mean, they're coming from a place of their theoretical and epistemological history and set of commitments, and so you get into discussions about like, well, that DBR project is doing ethnography and producing narratives of what's happening from the perspective of the participants, and we know that that's not a stable form of knowledge that we can trust, quote unquote. And that's coming from a very particular stance about like how knowledge gets produced in the social sciences and how that either is warranted based on what had happened in the setting and all sorts of things. And that's been a lot of the discussion, is to try to think about the different kinds of work that need to go on to understand different parts of the learning experience from different perspectives, both in terms of researcher versus participant, and also from different theoretical perspectives. So I do think like those methodological critiques that kind of come from just a different epistemological stance have actually dampened down over the last handful of years. I think we've gotten outside of the paradigm wars that were a little bit more full force around 2002, 2003, it seems. But that was a lot of the initial pushback.
Yeah, I think that this actually leads me to a kind of like thinking about how the world thinks about DBR more broadly. And one of the things that I feel like I often get whenever I talk about our work is, so did you have kids take standardized tests and how did they do on those? Right? And so that's not coming from it's also it's a critique that's coming from a view of sort of a scaled discourse about how we know if kids are doing okay in school. And I do think it's interesting for us to think about as a field about how that's sort of been finding its way into the responses to DBR as a method. And I actually think it's an echo of previous kinds of critiques coming from a different direction now. So I think I don't mean to be saying that I do think the sort of methods wars have declined within sort of the academic fields, but I think they're happening on different territory now.
And so just to kind of give a concrete example of that, a while ago, interacting with kind of a scholar who does detailed work around assessment, learning about DBR, reflecting on it as a method. And the reaction was, well, if you get to set the design focus of the learning experience and actually develop the measures of what gets seen as learning within that space, then you're set up to succeed. Like you're basically able to set the targets you want and move the learners towards those. And I have issues with that. And so we got into a discussion of saying, like, so, if, and part of the argument from the DBR researcher side, or research team side, is that you need different assessments than those that are typically in place in order to see the learning process and outcomes you care about. And so, like, that's often why you're in the space of figuring out ways to see learning, and not just resting on kind of existing assessment pieces that are in play. The discussion that's, I think, useful and productive is then to say, like, well, so what are the outcomes we care about? Like, so if the outcomes that we've built into our DBR tied assessments are things that we value in the broad, or at least for this community, then obviously, like, we are on a different platform of, like, understanding progress than if you're thinking that somehow you have to just make progress on the high stakes achievement test because that's the only thing that matters. So I do think, like, that's a good productive discussion to have, and is part of how people react to the work, kind of in that critical assessment kind of perspective.
And I think we mentioned this before. I mean, one of the other things that so DBR is a kind of mix, as a meta method that could employ many mixed methods, not only different theoretical traditions, but different methods within the sort of meta method. I mean, Anne Brown always intended that, right? She never intended it for it to be located within one methodological tradition. And I do think sometimes, like, so I just guess I want to be clear, is I don't mean to say that test scores, for example, are the only quantitative way we might engage with DBR, but so I do think that there's ways that it could potentially also be a good challenge to the field, and I think that there have been some really fabulous studies that have been coming out that have tried to take up a quantitative way of looking at what's happening too, that isn't necessarily test scores, but is trying to look at a larger scale. And I actually think it's given rise in part to things like DBIR, right? And thinking about, okay, so how are we going to do this in a way that is more aligned with some of the things that we value and that we know about learning, right? That that forges new ground to think about that. So.
Yeah, and so you just mentioned DBIR, so design-based implementation research. And actually, I'm wondering, just for clarification's sake, would you mind sort of saying a couple of things about how DBIR sort of got spun out of this, emerging field of design-based research? It feels like that sort of is also somewhat central, I think, to the conversation that we're having in terms of, like, what are the strengths of DBR and what are some of the critiques, and how does this field sort of change, given that it is kind of flexible and can incorporate so many methodologies and theoretical traditions.
Yeah, I mean, part of a reaction to kind of the early phase of DBR work that was happening in very particular sites of learning and teaching was that it was just a bunch of hothouse efforts, right? So you kind of have a lot of intensive focus being poured into a particular location and set of participants, and you see things shifting, and that's, from one stance, that's all well and good, but, like, what does that help us understand about the world more broadly? And then,
so these were cases, in other words.
There were cases or particular classrooms, that were shifted. Like, it is incredibly intensive work to do DBR, and you often are doing that in a team-like way, and for that reason, if you're going to study things carefully, within that and understand how to shift the circumstances of learning kind of in that responsive way, it's hard to do that at scale. Like, so it's a different kind of engagement when you're working across, 40 classrooms and working inside of one. So with that as kind of a bit of a backdrop, you had kind of a growing policy discussion largely in DC kind of places around scaling, that was happening about a decade ago, and different perspectives on scaling within education specifically, and thinking about how that happens within, healthcare and other complex institutions. And you had an approach that Bill Penuel and other colleagues at SRI and Michigan, Barry Fishman, Britta Chang and Nora Savelli, basically wanting to say, well, we can think about improvement within organizations at different levels as a design project. Actually, you can actually use kind of a design stance to get different parts of the system to better coordinate with each other, so that maybe the state level policies get implemented within a school district that set up particular routines and supports and experiences that then teachers are brought into, and then teachers go back to their classrooms and bring students into different kinds of instructional moments. So that led to design-based implementation research as a new methodological stance in the work. It'd be interesting to kind of to think with Megan about how she sees DBR and DBIR intersecting. I see them as kind of overlapping kind of endeavors in a lot of ways, but DBIR is intentionally trying to think at broader systems level and leverages different theory in order to do that, more organizational behavior sorts of things, and kind of institutional cultural change sorts of perspectives. So you can think about like how you can build capacity to kind of engage in improvement work within the district and within sites of learning that the district is connected to as an endeavor that you can improve upon through iterative cycles. So that is kind of the short version of that. It's very different than other images of scaling, which has to do more with kind of fidelity of uptake of program, which is more, I kind of use the shorthand, throw it over the wall kind of models, where you kind of like have a thing and you want the system to take up the thing and like, oh, go do this new curriculum that we have for, for math or for after-school tinkering, like take it up and run with it, without realizing that ongoing co-design and fitting of tools and ideas to local settings isn't an ongoing necessary project, which I think from a DBR stance, we all have that commitment that you actually need the ongoing work to figure out how to get things to work within particular locations through ongoing design work that's bound up inside of DBIR.
Yeah, and I actually think this gets to, it's not unrelated to some of the issues of equity and Phil's point about the politic of things and sort of what I was trying to weave in terms of how do we understand the ways that the reproduction of inequities might happen. And so, for me, I personally am grappling with what's the relationship between DBIR and things like third-generation activity systems. And, the way that Phil just described that is very much taking some, thinking about school systems as the place to scale, although there are plenty of places that are working in informal environments and also thinking about that in different kinds of ways. And right now, I think that there's much to learn about that. And if we think about some of the expansions that we've learned through DBR about potentially thinking about the development of chosen expertise, right, across multiple pathways, and understanding sort of how kids and learners navigate across a multiplicity of settings, and how they influence things like identity and interest development. So then the question is how do we, for me, I continue to think about how is it that we understand those things about learning and imagine what the move is. And so I think right now there's some really interesting questions about how we do that. And are we scaling across geographies, and what kinds of geographies right now, right? So we could engage in, I'm engaged in I think about it as a kind of DBIR project where I'm not within a school district, I'm across a multiplicity of organizations focused on Indigenous learners specifically. Some are school districts, some are nonprofits, some are after-school programs, some are, right, that they've decided they're going to think about their programs with these other lenses. And it is not entirely clear to me what it looks like to scale. So, I'm sort of in the middle of that. But I think that it's a different focus than thinking about the organizational unit being a district. And so I think there's things to learn there, and the same ways we learned about sort of ontological innovations. I almost feel like we're starting to beg for a different kind of grammar for innovations that are related to the kinds of, like, we have to figure out a different word than scale almost. But I think that the field is looking for that kind of new grammar, frankly.
And I think it turns around, there are different projects to do kind of across places, over longer time periods than what DBR historically focused on, and to think about kind of coordination and sustainability and coherence of learning within particular populations or spaces is an important new project. I kind of want to make a point that Meg and I were talking about a little bit before the webinar this morning, that just because there is a lot of energy around DBIR as a methodological stance right now, we don't want to lose our history on DBR and the utility of doing very close, focused, detailed work to kind of architect learning experiences and understand them in more smaller pitch ways. That those things go together in very powerful ways, and we need to kind of hold on to that as we kind of evolve our discussion of method.
Yeah. I mean, for me, one of the things, and I don't know that I thought this in the way that I'm thinking this right now, is that one of the things that I think DBR, so one of the things that DBR does and DBIR also does, but they do it in this way that actually helps us, at least from my perspective, around understanding issues of equity and the reproduction of inequities, is that those things happen in micro moments, but they also happen at scale. And partly of having sort of a robust theory of change is we actually need to understand that toggling between scales. And one of the things that I think has happened is we often create policies that has no view of the kinds of ways that it plays out in the micro. And then we haven't done the work of understanding, so what are the implications of knowing this is how it plays in micro? What sorts of scale practices would help do broad work on shifting those micro interactions? And that feels like, I mean, and we can ask that about lots of things. That's not just an equity question, but that one is the one that I get drawn to.
Yeah. So I'm thinking about and which is related to discussion around agency. Some of what we've been talking about in terms of scale and working with different populations and equity. How do we do that as design-based researchers? How do we actually move about? Do you guys have a sense or a direction?
Yeah, so we heard about every fifth word, Nick, but I'm going to infer from agency and how do we do this out in communities about where you were headed with that. Yeah, it looks like you're having an internet hiccup there. So assuming that the rest of us are still live and going, I think, so part of, as I reflect back on DBR within the learning sciences field, there's been a bit of a salvation rhetoric kind of frame to it. Like, here comes an amazing interdisciplinary research team coming to figure out a new thing. We're going to move in that direction towards ambitious goals, and won't you work with us to let us come into your community and do this. So there is a history of that within the field, and there are kind of important conversations to open up, I think, in ways that are genuine, to say, can we explore a new possibility that isn't something that's been rooted within a particular community. Same time, I do think the agency critique often has to do with issues of kind of who gets to set what learning agenda, who, is there sovereignty in the space to have people say what the outcomes they care about are? Will researchers reorient what they're doing in relation to that? Do they have a history with the community? Do they actually, have enough of a history that they're considered insiders in that community in ways that get them into a more trusted, collaborative, co-design space? And I'm excited actually within the field to see a lot more participatory stances being bound up in the DBR work as it gets architected. I think it's an ongoing thing for us to figure out new models for doing that. But it's exciting to see so much of it show up at our conferences and journals.
Yeah, and just Nick, reading your question, what new methods do we need? And I actually, so part of it is that I don't. So I'm not sure that it's a new methods question or if it's an expanded theoretical lens to engage with the method, right? And maybe there are new methods that will emerge from that, or new sort of toolkits to bring in. I mean, I for me, I think DBIR and third generation activity systems will do an enormous amount of work for us here, and I partly think, how is it that we expand our theoretical territories to be able to investigate things? And on some level, we've been doing that already, right? That's one of the beautiful things about design, is that it's generative. It's intentionally generative. And so I also think it's an interesting thing to think about, is that how do we continue to sort of have our own knowledge history in the field when we're in a field that is intending to cultivate innovation and change all the time? And so I think that there are longer sort of questions about how do we continue to cultivate a sort of so I don't want to call it a coherent community, because I think communities are always changing, but I do think there needs to be some center of gravity about these things. And sometimes I wonder that are the critiques are coming because we're not always sort of feeling connected to a center of gravity about this, and we kind of forget that part of the point here is maybe not to always come to finalized absolute knowledge claims. If we have a view that peoples are shifting and the kinds of things that are changing about the way that lives unfold, then we'll always have great, I still love design principles, we'll have great theoretical insights, but I don't know that we'll get to a definitely do it this way all the time. And sometimes I feel like the desire for it, and that's one of those questions from the outside that I actually think ends up sparking lots of things for us about what's the demand for sort of us demonstrating why we should be valued to sort of an external community. And so I do think that it's about expanded theoretical territory at least.
I just to play off that, I do think, like, in terms of design methods, I think like more participatory co-design, collaborative design is actually kind of a new part of kind of a renegotiated agency, strategy. And so just kind of highlight that. I think if you think of there should be really great, interesting YPAR models of DBR work that happen, and that kind of thing, just to kind of look at kind of ways in which we imagine how to create learning environments and what we're studying and hoping from them. The other thing that I'll kind of underscore a little bit that's in our discussion, but I kind of want to surface, is that the stance of the researcher in the space is very different than other research paradigms. So, like, it's much more as collaborator and co-participant within the space than it is somehow like handing off a thing for other people to make use of, and you don't want to actually contaminate the space and introduce confounds by interacting with it. So that calls for all sorts of new competencies for researchers to be engaged, like developing partnerships and developing trust within their networks in order to actually do the kind of collaborative work, especially around issues of equity and social justice. Like, you have to like navigate into trusted spaces in order to then pose the kinds of design studies that help you to start to do work on those problems. That's not something you can just show up and like launch into a project, within a month to kind of, open up new terrain. Like it's a multi-year effort to kind of get into that kind of relationship with folks in ways that allow you to do the work that I think we need to be doing.
Yeah, and I think the thing that Phil's bringing up is actually connected to that critique about it costs a lot, or there's a lot of data, there's those kinds of things. And in our class that we teach, we often talk about that, as a graduate student, and the idea of doing a DBIR study is probably impractical unless you're part of a team already doing it. that for me feels like an okay thing to say. I'm sure there are people who would push back on that, but I don't think it's a practical thing, because I think that we've gotten to methods, like other fields, I should say, where a singular researcher doesn't ever have the capacity to do the kind of inquiry and knowledge creation. And so our field is in this weird place, right, where the idea that our science actually needs interdisciplinary teams to make progress is sort of intuitively right to, I think, the field of DBR, but I don't know that it's intuitively right to our larger field of education.
And it might not be intuitively right to like policymakers or the funders that you're trying to communicate this work to.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, I think one way that shows up, and it kind of goes off of kind of Megan's point around the cost of this kind of work, you know, you have people making very principled arguments to say, should we be focused on exploring educational innovation at a time and within a set of structures that can't actually support it at scale? So you have people saying, well, you know, maybe a well-taught, more conservative pedagogy will lead to more equity and progress than a poorly taught, more progressive, complicated pedagogy. So then you get into those. That's another kind of area of discussion to think through and push back to think about what is the role of cultivating innovations, where Carl Breiter kind of makes an argument in a 2002 piece that DBR is really the only method of the social sciences that lets you understand innovation in a more transformative way, because it's designed to do that work. It's less, many of the other traditions of social sciences are much more cautious or kind of incremental in terms of the design work that's put in play for comparison and study. And so how much of a research portfolio should be focused on innovation and cultivating that and understanding it? Do we think we can actually shift things at scale to make a more kind of liberation, progressive pedagogy happen at scale? Like, I think that's a good discussion for us to kind of hold on to.
It makes me think of Danny Martin, maybe 2006 piece, I'm not sure if that's right at all, talked a little bit about how we're increasingly in this time of sort of a solution on demand kind of rhetoric. And he talked about that we're actually talking about generations old problems, right? And that the idea of a solution on demand and the need for a complete solution on demand is actually a setup demand for failure if we take the deep problems of things like equity, whether it's gender equity, racial equity, sexual orientation equity. All of those things have really deep social histories, and it minimizes their complexities to think that we'll be able to come up with a design, and now we'll have the scalable solution for that problem over multiple places. And I think that that's a really important thing. And I think that sometimes, though, right, like you get these wicked problems, and I'm using that language on purpose right now, where sometimes people don't, like the avoidance of dealing with the long complexity of that. Certainly in some of my classes, we talk about how that's a really privileged stance. And so I think that when we start thinking about the expansion to co-design, it is a move, I think, that it fundamentally takes up the problems of power that might be implicitly embedded in some of the ways that design has worked. And I do, so I think I'm backing off that maybe it's not just method. So I appreciate that. I guess I'm suggesting that I think we have theory work to do to understand where would we move it. And I think the co-design piece is one that increasingly is important, right? And it does fundamentally talk about disrupting the kinds of powered relations that have happened a long time in research. Never mind the kinds of powered relations that unfold in all kinds of ways in all kinds of places. So, yeah. So I wonder. Sometimes I wonder to myself: is the paradigm of design part of like sometimes the sort of rapid prototyping of materials? Like, is there a problem with that? And I like to do rapid design of prototypes, by the way. So it's like a self-critique of trying to figure out if we have too much of a materials focus, how do we continue to do the sort of explicit work on some of these other levels that are necessary? And at the same time, materials travel the world, right? So not doing materials, somebody's materials are traveling the world. And so I often toggle between those things.
Is my audio coming through better now, by the way?
Yep.
Great. So I want to kind of actually step a half a step back in this discussion around co-design and sort of participatory design research, because this is something that I've also sort of struggled with personally, is like, especially when we talk about these Megan, around equity and problems that have really deep social histories. How do we, as researchers, enter into a place where we're doing design research?
We lost you, Nick.
Be it in a class. Oh, sorry. Again. How do we, as researchers, invite the practitioners that we're working with to, wrestle with these concepts that they might not necessarily be very well versed in, from a theoretical, social history of inequity or gender or racialized spaces and different, types of learning, for instance. So I'm wondering if you two can sort of speak to how you might have struggled with that in terms of design research.
Yeah, let me, I can talk through an example quickly and connect some dots in our conversation, I think. We've had a 3-year collaboration with 2 school districts here in the Seattle area to implement aspects of the new vision for K-12 science ed. That particular project, which we talked briefly about in the previous webinar, it took us a few years to get to the point where we could actually focus deeply in our discussion and design work around kind of culturally and linguistically diverse learners within their district. And that was a negotiated, move to say, let's make that focal within our shared work together. And so now that we've gotten to that point, and that's kind of on the table, now we need to kind of open up dimensions of how that shows up in micro moments of teaching and learning within classroom life, and the teacher's role in that space, knowing that these are tied to longer histories and cross-setting dimensions of complication as well. And our stance is that those moments of classroom life can be shaped in more expansive ways to kind of orient to kids' language, to actually show them how it can be related to scientific sense-making of phenomena that we care about. And we need to kind of do that within moment work, realizing that the broader project and history of these kids is tied up in a lot of other moments of their life tied to other institutions. And some of those are kind of spaces where we can start to think about active coordination, because the district does have connections out into after-school spaces for these particular youth, and we're trying to formalize those partnerships to try to kind of put more robust approaches in place across settings. Others are not, actually, and so then you're kind of realizing that the design work that you have in front of you is partial in some respect, but hopefully still contributing to opening up possibilities. And that's where a lot of the empirical work goes. Like, if you dramatically shift classroom life or an after-school program space, can you get kind of a shift in science identification over a certain period of time, where we think that has a long-term consequence for the youth in terms of how they might, pursue different pathways downstream. Do you want to talk about an example on your side?
Well, I guess partly what I've been grappling with is I think a lot about the responsibility of engaging people in co-design, and so I'm always thinking of so I work at a university, and when we ask folks who have less privileged employment possibilities in the world to open up critical dialogue, public critical dialogue, there's a risk factor that is more prevalent for someone who's not inhabiting the same positionality as me. So I think a lot about that, and I do think that there is I think researcher competencies about that is partly about all of us getting much better at actually understand. There's lots of work about this stuff, right? There's lots of been great work about understanding how power and privilege plays out. It just hasn't necessarily been focused on the ways that these sort of relationships get negotiated all the time. So I actually think there's lots to help us here. But I also think that there's, to me, one of the things that you're pointing out is far more deeply theorizing adult learning, not just for researchers, but for some. So for me, I think a lot about, I engage community members and teachers, and when we get deeply into some of the critical theoretical space that we do get to, right? So I tend to try to bring in, so what's good scholarship around this, and engage this with folks who are not scholars, right? And that might look different than what a graduate student is doing, but we do that, and it can have massive impacts. And so then part of the challenge is what's the responsible way to support groups of people through thinking through and making sense of that complicated territory. And oftentimes, if we're only, I felt like when I started this work, I did not have adequate tools to understand what it looked like to support an expanded view of participatory practice. And manage that, right? And I mean that not in like a sort of logistical management, but in a learning kind of facilitation management. And I think that that's really important work and interesting. And I think the same is probably true for teachers, right? Like there's at times at which this becomes complicated. There's another project that I did with Shashay Kone, and it became really interesting to think about the teachers who were, when we started sort of really surfacing and being able to talk about some of the dynamics in their classrooms, when they became very clear that they were responding to their boys of color differently, there quickly becomes a risk factor for them in that emerged about what does it mean to keep doing this. Like, I know this is the right thing to do, but at some point now we're talking about things that like challenge whether or not I should be a teacher. And I'm not saying that that's right, but it is a human response to sort of starting to recognize some of your own things in particular ways. And so, learning how to support teachers through those pretty complicated things is expanding what it means to understand adult learning and sort of adult transformations too. So, and I think we're getting work about this now, right? Like it's starting to emerge, and I think that those are good places for us to ask questions about and to live in a bit. I just want to ask, I have no idea how to think about, and it's a project that a few of us are starting to think about, is, so what might that mean for the preparation of graduate students or apprenticing in folks into co-design spaces? And I think that is a remarkably hard question that we're going to continue to learn about, right? But I think it's the right question, and it's sort of exciting to think that we could get really good at developing a field of researchers who could ethically and successfully develop co-partnerships to make change. That's a fairly cool possibility that's emerging in the field.
Yeah, right on. Right on. Peter, do you have anything that you want to, and you've done more design-based research than I have.
Well, I mean, I just wanted to echo what Megan said, because in my graduate program, my advisor was Luis Gomez, and he, as part of our sort of learning experience, even though it wasn't part of our course load, it wasn't part of what was formally sort of checked off as part of our program, partnership building and co-design was sort of embedded in everything that we did, and I felt like it was a steep, I don't know what you'd say, steep, harsh learning curve as far as developing that skill, and it's developing even after doing it for a while, but it seems so important because it's the aspect of the research that's often hidden. And as Megan, as you're talking about building a theory of adult learning or understanding theories of adult learning as we have these transformative experiences with our partners, being transparent about that as part of our methods description in studies, or being transparent about our partnership building and the sort of the joint ways that the research is negotiated with our partners is so important. And I love it when it is transparent and it's documented rather than being sort of hidden and tidied up in the journal articles that we produce.
Yeah, I think there's a lot to be learned about kind of why partnerships fail and why they kind of lead to complicated things that we often don't actually make explicit. I do want to kind of highlight that it is an exciting time for the field to formalize how it engages in the partnership work, and actually we need more studies of it. But there are also efforts, including learndbir.org, that are trying to pull together kind of tools that are used to negotiate partnerships, and have those come from previous successful ones. And I know WT Grant Foundation has a similar kind of website to try to help teams that are launching into this work understand the history of kind of how those power relations can play out in good and bad ways within the work, and then what are the tools to like negotiate shared work and like continue to renegotiate. How do you actually develop models of shared governance and capacity building so that you're actually thriving, and it's more of a ongoing win-win sort of relationships in place, and that you focus the research on issues that matter for practice.
Yeah, and I'll just say in my early, when we first started doing sort of community-based design research, it was actually community members who were lifelong organizers, community organizers, that started saying, we should do this activity, and then we should do this other activity, and they actually, and partly because we had made the commitment to say, okay, when we're not going to be the only decision makers about how this process unfolds, we did it. We followed it, and it actually has become sort of solidified tools about what I actually think broadly are good tools. But it really, some of those things they flat out came from organizing work that has been in play for decades. And so that for me is a exciting thing that is happening. And then I think all the tools that are being developed are being carved in ways that make them specifically useful and sort of reflective of the things that we also know as a field, and that's good stuff.
As early career researchers sort of build their identity, I'm curious, as you think about building a competency of partnerships, do you think it rises to the level of just like some people characterize themselves as a science ed person or a math ed person? Do you think that being like a partnership person rises to that level, or is it a cross-cutting skill that's necessary for all sort of learning scientists to be able to employ in an empathetic and effective way?
That's a really interesting question. Just if you think about organization and sociology of our fields and how we kind of organize ourselves. I have historically thought of it as kind of a fluency or literacy competency that all learning scientists who engage in this kind of collaborative work need to have, recognizing that some people actually have deeper expertise in particular aspects of that than others, and affinities and histories that set them up to do different dimensions of that work better than others. That's an interesting question to say, do we need actually a layer of scholars that actually focus on partnership kind of development and coordination work kind of as a area of expertise that layers in as a collaborator kind of on a team? I think there are instances of that maybe happening out of the organizational policy part of colleges of ed, where you have people who have a bit of that, and that they're getting interested in DBR and like how DBR might work. But I don't think that's been kind of a thriving history of that happening. But that's a great question. I don't know if you have a reaction to that.
It's a really hard question, so I'll say something, and it always makes me nervous because this actually will live on past this conversation. So I say this totally tentatively. So the extent to which creating innovative partnerships requires a deep look at social histories and issues of power, I worry about it becoming sequestered in one field of I'm going to identify as this form of expert. And partly I'm thinking about like the impetus to start this class with a few faculty was, okay, we have some students who I feel like get the issues, which means for me they were demonstrating some theoretical competence and sort of sensibilities around things, and then we sort of I've invited students into partnership space, which to me is really important space, and they have violated all of those theoretical competencies, right, in the way that they've interacted, and not, you know, recoverable ways, understandable ways, but that sort of that transition didn't go very well, and so we really started thinking about, like, okay, so now how do you help people learn how to do this in practice? And so to me, I do think PDR is a kind of practice, but I worry about it being sequestered, not only because it means that I think it could open some ways that you end up tokenizing PDR kind of work, but I also think it actually could reduce the kinds of complex understandings we could emerge, because I think that part of what we're increasingly learning about knowledge creation is that the sort of strict domain focus, and where I mean domain in a really narrow way right now, is being pushed on, right? It's not really how learning works. It's not how kids' lives unfold. And so partly I think the challenge you're asking is also about us recognizing that there's a difference in the way that humans learn. And so now we're trying to figure out, what does that mean around expert competencies, be able to see that better, right? And study it in more expansive ways. So I don't know about that, but it is sort of where I'm at about that, is that I actually think you need both. And maybe there are people who have lead foots, right? Like, one is, I'm going to position myself that way, but I don't think it can be the kind of thing that you can do without others.
Because the team has to actually adopt the stance to embed and collaborate deeply across research and practice. And so, like, the danger of segmenting is that we reinscribe the research to practice kind of divide.
Yeah. I think this is actually a really big tension for early scholars, because I think we're often told that what we need to do is find sort of what our niche is, or identify ourselves as the person that does this thing, right? And so sort of being able to be flexible in a team environment where we're working with practitioners and trying to sort of straddle this role of being a researcher and a co-participant, I think is a real struggle, and again sort of grates against some of what we're taught in our early careers.
Yeah, and some of, like, so when I write external review letters for folks going up for, you know, tenure and promotion who have done DBR work, invariably I find myself wanting to make clear the role of design and partnership work as, like, a central dimension of the scientific program of those folks, and, like, the time commitment and the grant development work, and, like, the details of navigating, like, the trade-off between deep engagement in practice spaces versus scholarship production, like, just to help their broader community understand kind of the work involved with doing design research from a scholarship stance. And that's an important conversation to kind of make sure that we hold on to help folks be able to kind of early in their career still be in that work and not have to, like, segment themselves out of it just to navigate the politics of a review moment.
I also think that as early career folks, there's a rhythm to DBR or DBIR work that is often not aligned with sort of this is Phil's point, the rhythms of academic institutions. And I think that I think that until you've watched it play out, as someone who feels like I think I've gone through a round now, maybe two. It works out, but it's highly, like, so, you know, I didn't write for 2 or 3 years because I was deep in the middle of a bunch of projects. And as a young scholar, people think that, I mean, people started to say, I'm not going to be an academic. I have a writing problem. In fact, that was, right, like, there were a series of things that started to be generated about my identity, in part because of the rhythm of where we were in these larger DBR projects. And I think that, like, that view is partly what that challenge becomes.
And then individual people have to make choices about how risk averse they are to those sorts of critiques in their particular context. And, you know, people make different choices in that moment.
So we only have 1 minute left in the discussion, so I'm just curious. We've covered a lot of ground, and I think that this final conversation we've been having is one thing that's really important. So I just want to invite you guys to sort of wrap it up maybe with some closing thoughts.
I think if people are new to DBR and trying to find their way into it, we're at a point in the field now, 25 years in, of formalizing it, that we have resources to lean on in terms of articles that describe it and handbooks that detail it, as well as online archives. So just to point to one of those, the International Society of Learning Sciences has a network of program project called Naples. So if you search for Naples and ISLS, it'll pop right up. And there are, our course syllabi are there. There are a series of webinars that have been archived around different dimensions of DBR work. And so that would be a good kind of space to sink in. Yeah.
Just ditto that. I mean, I do think there is a good documented history of some of this now. And I think doing the work of knowing our histories is important. So. And
just to give you further clearance, like there are a group of federal agencies that pulled together common guidelines for educational research, and DBR is embedded as one of the set of methods. So you have some coverage that we didn't always have in the field to claim it as a federally sanctioned method. So good.
That's a good stamp to have, I guess.
It can help in a moment.
Peter, any last closing thoughts?
No, just thanks a lot, guys, for having this discussion. It's so interesting.
Yeah, yes, ditto to that as well.
Thank you both for organizing.
Yeah, thanks so much.
Yeah, so thanks everyone, and please feel free to continue the conversation on the Etherpad and on Twitter. Peter and I are going to host another session next week on stories from the field. And Peter, do you want to introduce who is going to be our guest for that session?
Sure. I think we have some great participants. Amina Norris from the Misrepresentation Project, Caitlin Martin from DYN in Chicago, and Vanessa Spila from University of New Mexico.
That's going to be a lot of fun. Great. Thanks again, everybody. Sorry to go over, but this was a fantastic conversation. And we'll see you on the interwebs.
Excellent. Thanks so much.
Thanks. Bye-bye.
Yeah.